If any of you are new to these Sunday sermons, there are a couple ways to interact with me. You can use the chat to chat with me and anyone else who's here on the session. You can also use the Q&A box to ask questions at any time, and I'll be keeping my eye on that Q&A box. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, I don't check the comment thread as the session is live, but I do go back and take a look and answer questions after the fact. So you'll just have to be patient and wait until the session is over. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a slide presentation as usual. So let's see. There we go. All right. And for those who are joining me here in Zoom, if I could just get confirmation in the chat that you can see the slides, that you're hearing me okay, that everything seems to be working properly. All good from Tom and Karen. Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Okay. So before I dive into some of the nitty gritty here, I'm going to say a few things that you might already know, starting with, I am not a lawyer. So please don't construe any of this as legal advice. Mainly, I'm doing this session because I see people sign a lot of bad contracts, and I want to, if I can, save at least one person the grief of that horrible feeling when you realize you've signed something that you probably shouldn't have, and sometimes you don't realize it until years after the fact. Publishing contracts are they're challenging in that once you sign them, they have the potential to be in effect for many, many, many years. So you really want to pay attention to a few really critical clauses in any publishing contract that you're considering. My experience with contracts first began when I worked at a traditional publishing company. And as an editorial director and publisher, of course, I had to be familiar with the contract we were asking authors to sign. And I also, as I became more advanced in my career, I ended up doing some of the negotiation myself with agents and with authors, although there was a contracts manager at the publishing company I worked for who did the final, sign off and approved any changes that were made to that contract. What I can tell you for sure is that any publishing contract you sign is for the benefit of the publisher and not for the benefit of you. So always understand that. I'm not saying that publishers are evil, but they are looking after their own interests. And some contracts are more fair than others. So the first thing to understand is that every publishing contract is negotiable, or it ought to be negotiable. Certainly, every publisher is different. Every contract is different. And so some publishers will be very flexible on certain types of terms, while other publishers will never negotiate in those same areas. I think what makes it challenging for the average writer or author is that if you're totally new to this publisher or totally new to this sort of negotiation, you might not yet know where the flexibility lies, where you can push, where you can expect to get better terms. So that's why we have agents. That's why literary agents can be so valuable, because through their many years of experience, they know what's negotiable and they know where not to even try. In today's session, which, it's going to be a fairly limited look at the contract. We can't go over everything you might see. I do want to talk about the areas that usually raise the most concern, the pitfalls that, can really affect the long-term life of your project or your career, and how to make sure that you're getting a fair shake. Certainly, I would encourage you for any book contract to not go it alone, if at all possible. Probably the most affordable option if you're looking at a book publishing contract is to become a member of the Authors Guild, which I think it's no more than $150. It's probably even more affordable if you're an emerging writer. And take advantage of their contract review service, which they offer to all members for free. They will help you avoid a lot of the problems in book contracts. And of course, there are literary lawyers and other people who can help you. But still, I think it's important to at least know some of the groundwork, even if you have someone helping you. And there are also other types of contracts that you might be signing where you'll want to be raising some of the same questions, like when you sign contracts for essays or anthologies or articles, magazines, when you're doing interviews and maybe you're asked to sign certain types of release forms. It's good to be familiar with the language that gets used. Okay, so moving on. As I said, the publishing contracts you sign, by and large, are going to favor the publisher. And I'm talking primarily here about what we call the boilerplate contract. So no matter who you're dealing with, if on the first time that they send you something to sign, most likely they are sending you what's called the boilerplate. And that means it's the contract that it's where the negotiation starts, and it 100% likely favors the publisher. But there's lots of things in there that you don't know about that they would change if you asked or if you knew to ask. So that's what I want to delve into further. A well-negotiated contract is going to protect you if and when things go bad. Now, we all hope that the relationship goes smoothly, that you're going to, have a very productive, prosperous relationship with your editor and with the publishing company or with the magazine or whomever it is. Just because you have a good relationship today and because you're often very excited, contracts represent opportunities. Because of these issues, you may just overlook things that feel like they would never happen. Like, it might be very hard to imagine you not feeling happy about your editor if you're getting along really well today. It might feel difficult to imagine your publisher going bankrupt. It might be difficult to imagine a disagreement that would lead you to walk away from the publishing agreement. But these things happen all the time. So the contract language is there, I think, in part, when things go bad, you are still protected and you have a way, you have a set of guidelines that show you how to proceed, what are the next steps, and so that it's very clear how to either get out of the contract or how to resolve disagreements. Now, before I keep promising to get to the contract itself, and I will, but it's also important before I get into the different clauses you're going to encounter to understand what I'm not talking about. So I am not talking about terms of service. So terms of service are the sorts of things that you agree to with Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, or when you decide to use Ingram Spark as your distributor. It also applies to things like social media services, or if you're using WordPress.com or Medium or some other places where you're not actually dealing with the editor, you're not being given a contract with your name on it. Rather, you are basically agreeing, yes, these terms of service, I will abide by them. And of course, this puts all the power in the hands of the company that you're dealing with. But you don't really have a choice, right? Like, your Ingram Spark and Amazon KDP are not going to negotiate individual agreements for every single author that uses their distribution and retail services. There are thousands, if not millions, of people taking advantage of these distribution and retail agreements. So it's a take it or leave it sort of proposition. That's not to say you shouldn't understand the terms of service, that you shouldn't understand what the sort of agreement that you're entering into, how to walk away, what the penalties might be if you don't abide by the terms of service, but you're not going to negotiate the terms of service with Amazon. So I just want to make it clear, that's not part of today's conversation, but we are talking about the sorts of contracts that you would receive from a HarperCollins or a Simon & Schuster or a Penguin Random House, or, as I said, a publication. It might even be an individual who wants to publish your material in some sort of a collection. All right, so here we go, or here we are with some of the specific clauses that I would like to talk about. I'm going to be talking specifically about traditional book publishing contracts. Once you get into other types of book publishing contracts, like a self-publishing contract, sometimes a hybrid publishing contract, those can be very different. And they are more like service agreements. You are hiring a service to do something for you in exchange for some money. I'm not talking about those today either. I'm really just talking about a traditional book publishing contract, which has three really vital clauses. There's a grant of rights clause. There are clauses that deal with payment, like the advance and royalties. And then there's a reversion of rights clause. So let's talk about the grant of rights, because almost every contract you sign in the publishing world is going to have some sort of grant of rights. It's usually right at the beginning of the contract. And it indicates usually, the beginning of the relationship. You are granting your rights to this publisher to do something with your work, to publish it, to distribute it, to profit off of it. So there are several different types of grant, or different facets to this grant of rights clause. The grant of rights is going to cover the geography or territories covered. So a publisher, for instance, may be asking for a grant of rights that covers publication in North America, or it might be a world rights grant of rights, meaning they have the ability to publish all around the world, not just North America. Then you get into grant of rights related to formats. So most book publishers are going to want a grant, the right to publish in print, in digital, like ebook, and audiobook. And in fact, it's very rare that you'll find a big five publisher today that will accept a contract that doesn't include print, ebook, and audio. They normally have to have all three. It's not negotiable. There used to be, once upon a time, you could just do a print contract or just do an ebook contract, but it's not very common. It's very, very rare. There are some backlist publishers like Open Road that might do an ebook only. But in any event, if you're selling a book, you should expect to grant rights for all formats, unless it's a very small publisher. Grant of rights also covers what length of time we're talking about. So there are usually two different types of time periods in these contracts. One is called life of copyright, which sounds really scary. And then there are also fixed term contracts, which they'll last for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. So the contract has a really particular end date. Most book publishing contracts you see, if they're very traditional, are going to be life of copyright contracts, which simply mean that the contract is in effect for as long as the work is under copyright, and if the reversion clause hasn't somehow been activated. We'll talk about the reversion of rights later. Then the grant of rights will cover language. So is it just for English language? Does it cover translations? And there'll also be sub-rights discussed throughout the contract, not just in the grant of rights, but there's usually a whole section of the contract that talks about all of the different rights that the publisher can sell. So this can be everything from those foreign rights or translation rights to mass market paperbacks, to book clubs, to serializations. It even includes things like merchandising and theme parks. So if someone wants to make a theme park based on your book, then the contract might actually grant the publisher the ability to sell those rights. Now, there's also TV and film rights and all sorts of dramatic rights. And, as I said earlier, every contract is different, and every publisher is going to have certain types of expectations about what this grant of rights will include. If you have a literary agent, generally their preference is going to be to retain as many rights as possible for you so that they can be sold on an a la carte basis, or so that you can exercise more control over them. But it really depends on the publisher, but most book publishers aren't in a position to be selling or to be making TV shows or films, and often authors will retain those rights and the agent will sell them with the help of a co-agent. I see that there's a question from Diana about whether I recommend having a lawyer at the Authors Guild review an agent contract as well. So since I brought up agents, I do want to address that briefly. If you're already a member of Authors Guild, by all means, have them review that agent contract. Agent contracts usually, they will cover a particular period of time that the agent has to sell the book. And normally you can get out of an agent contract within, say, 30 or 60 days of written notice. I would compare it to something like a real estate agent contract that you might sign, where you're basically, you're promising, yes, you are my agent of record. I'm not going to go off and try to do things behind your back. I don't have some other agent who's representing me. It's you and me together on this, and you are the one who's going to represent me for this project. There are some kind of not so great agent contracts that might say that they have the right to the work that's sold, even beyond, like if they sell it to a publisher, they might have the right to represent it and profit off it even after they've sold it that first time. So kind of like an in perpetuity sort of agreement, which would tie you to that agent forever and ever and ever and ever. I don't think that's good. And if you're worried about an agent contract that you have in front of you, I would suggest having the Authors Guild review it. And there are also some good literary lawyers who could help you. Peter Barron is one. His last name is spelled B-E-R-E-N, Peter Barron. All right. Now, I mentioned already that a big five publisher, or any publisher of size, they're going to expect to keep the print, the ebook, and the audiobook rights with that grant of rights clause. It's very hard to reserve those for yourself. It's also really hard to negotiate control over things like title, cover design, interior design, the formats and the pricing, meaning whether it's going to come out as hardcover, paperback, mass market, and also the payment schedules. So by payment schedules, I mean how often you're paid. Like, are you getting paid twice a year, once a year, every month? Publishers have systems set up, and they're not going to make an exception for one author out of 100 and pay you more frequently than everyone else or put you on a different schedule. They're just not set up to do that. So these are the areas where you basically, this is the when you want a traditional publisher, there are certain measures of control that you're giving up, and it's generally how the book is packaged is the big thing that immediately becomes outside of your control. Now, something I forgot to mention, though, is that you do get what's often called the right to be consulted, or your agent, if they're thoughtful, will add language in the contract that says something like, while the publisher has final say on the cover, they will consult with the author. There's something in there that indicates there will be a collaboration of one kind or another. And, publishers don't want to, wield their power or control in such a way that it makes you upset or angry. Like, they want you to feel happy with the process, and they want to preserve the relationship. So they will, in fact, consult with you, but you just have to remember that they do get final say, unless you're someone like a Stephen King, or you someone who has really a lot of leverage. Maybe then you will get right of approval, but that's pretty rare. All right, so now we come to payments, which is a favorite topic. So in the contract, a traditional publishing contract is going to address payment in a few ways. It's going to mention an advance, if there is one. It's going to go over the royalty schedule. It's going to go over what are called escalators, and I'll show you more about that in a moment. And it'll also talk about payments for subrights, in addition to telling you how often the payment's going to happen. So for those who are not familiar with advances and royalties, the advance is what you get paid before the book publishes. And then you have to earn out the advance through sales. And so some authors actually never receive royalties because they never earn out their advance. Doesn't mean you have to pay back the advance. A contract that stipulated that would not be typical. That would be a bad contract if you had to repay the advance, unless you failed in some way. So a failure would be you got paid in advance and you never turned in the manuscript. So usually a contract will say something like, then you, the author, if you failed to deliver, you're going to have to pay back the advance. Now, agents try to negotiate it so that the author is rarely ever made to pay back the advance. They try to always shift that responsibility or risk onto the publisher. And they also try to make it very hard for a publisher to reject the manuscript or do anything that would indicate failure on the part of the author without the author keeping the money they've already been paid. So trying to reduce the financial risk to the author. So if you don't have an agent, of course, it's going to be a little hard for you to know what clauses to put in there, but essentially a red flag should go up anytime there's an indication that you're paying money to the publisher, paying money back to the publisher because of something they don't like, where it feels like their judgment could be capricious or random, or they might just decide one day, oh, we really don't want to publish this book, we're going to reject it and get the advance back. So the contract should be written in such a way to make it hard for them to be totally random with their decision making. They have to follow a certain set of steps in order to get any payments back. The royalties, the royalties differ from publisher to types, categories of books, and they also involve escalators. So I'll show you what those escalators can look like. Any good contract for print royalties will have escalators, meaning you get paid more as the book is more successful. So escalators might start at 6%, 8%, 10%, 12%. This is just ballpark. It's not, it's not written in stone. And then you might see the escalators move up by 2.5% or 5% to each stage. So if you're not getting the advance that you want, let's say the advance is pretty minimal, instead of pushing for a higher advance, maybe the publisher's not willing, perhaps you could increase the favorability of the escalators. So maybe with the example I have up on the screen right now, maybe you could ask the publisher, hey, instead of having the 12.5 escalator kick in at 5,000, what if it kicks in at 2,500? Or what if I can how quickly can you get to that higher royalty rate, essentially is what you want to try to go for. Now, I want to mention the subrights piece because a really good contract will split out what the payment for subrights are for any rights that the publisher retains. So like before I mentioned theme park rights. So let's say the publisher did sell theme park rights on your behalf. Disney has licensed the theme park rights, and they have they paid you $1 million for those rights. Now, if the publisher has retained them, that contract should say how that percentage splits out. Is it 50% to them, 50% to you? Is it 90% to you, 10% to the publisher? So those percentages can become really important when you have a big payday come through because of a subright sale. So usually subrights, on things like foreign language rights, translation rights, things where the publisher typically has a lot of work involved in selling those rights, like going to rights fairs, etc. You might see something more like a 50-50, 60-40 split. But on other rights where, maybe the publisher isn't doing as much work, or maybe well, it's hard to say because there's so many different situations, but you might see more favorability toward the author, like for serial rights, for instance. So let's say the New Yorker publishes an excerpt from the book. The New Yorker, of course, pays for the right to do that. They pay the publisher. You might see yourself getting 90% of the payment and the publisher, say, taking 10%. So always look at those percentages carefully. If you have an agent, ask them if the percentages are standard, if they can be adjusted, so that you don't feel like the publisher is somehow getting more than their fair share from those rights sales. Yasmin asks, she's assuming the percentage breakdown only applies for rights the publisher retains, and absolutely yes. So like if it's an audiobook rights sale, this would be for an older contract, since publishers tend to retain audio rights now. But let's say 10 years ago, you signed a contract where you retained the audiobook rights. Then you would get 100% of that rights sale, but it would be likely because you or your agent sold those rights. Since your publisher doesn't get paid for them, they're not helping you sell those rights. It's out of their hands, and they're not incentivized to do anything to help you. Okay, and here's that escalator slide again. Denise said that she couldn't see anything show up, but I hope that you can see the numbers there on the left. Tom asks if you should retain copyright to your book or give it to the publisher. Every publishing contract, assuming it's not a work for hire, the publisher promises to file for copyright in your name. So this goes back to why the grant of rights clause is called the grant of rights. It's not grant of copyright. It's the right to publish or license or sell or distribute. It is not the intellectual property, but you are granting the right to the publisher to profit off of that property in collaboration or in partnership with you. You still retain the copyright yourself. The publisher files for copyright at the Copyright Office if you're in the US, and you get the copyright certificate. So there is nothing about any of this contract language that should take away your copyright or your intellectual property rights. That said, there are publishing contracts out there, legitimate ones, that are what we call work for hire. A work for hire contract means you are basically giving up all intellectual property rights, all moral rights, all copyright, and the publisher retains it, and you are hopefully getting paid appropriately. Cases where you would see this happen would be like, let's say you were writing a book for the Dummies series. I believe that series works on a work for hire basis. I can't be sure, but I know other series like the Dummies series operates in that way. There are some book packagers that work in that manner, meaning that they come up with the book ideas themselves, and then they farm out the writing to ghostwriters or to people who might be writing under pseudonyms. So think about like Nancy Drew series or these big brands where the books sell because of the brand and not because of the people who write the books, presumably. So those are cases where you might be doing it on a work for hire basis. This also tends to apply to novelizations of movies. So that's kind of a weird little sector of publishing, but you might not be retaining copyright for that sort of thing because you're just, you're literally a writer for hire in these instances who has been asked to execute something very specific rather than you going to the publisher with your own idea. Janie says she's a UK editor and contract negotiator, and she often receives inquiries from authors who signed a contract with an old-fashioned reversion clause where out of print is not defined. And is there anything that can realistically be done for these authors? So Janie, that's an excellent question, which I'm going to answer soon, because I need to first establish what that reversion clause is for those who don't know. Okay, so I talked about the grant of rights being the very beginning of the relationship and what rights you're allowing the publisher to pursue on your behalf. So if that's the engagement and the marriage, then the divorce or the parting of ways would be the reversion clause. So as Janie said, if you have a very old contract, the reversion clause may be written in such a way that it makes it very hard to get out of that contract. Today's reversion clauses really need to indicate a sales threshold or a royalty threshold, like the payments you receive every 6 months or whatever. They need to indicate a level at which when sales dip below this amount or when payments dip below this amount, you can ask for your rights back. So what is that amount? Again, it's going to depend on the publisher, but we're talking about, hundreds of copies are selling in a year, or you're only receiving hundreds of dollars in a year. Obviously, the higher the number is, the more it benefits you. The lower the number, the more it benefits the publisher. So usually these reversion clauses give the publisher a chance, like say 3 months, 6 months, a year, to revive or get the book back on track or do something to turn around the fortunes of the book. But if the book is quite old and it stops selling and the publisher's not interested, typically, they're going to revert the rights. Let's hope that they revert the rights. There is a really good book on this topic that's available for free. It's called Understanding Rights Reversion: When, Why, and How to Regain Copyright and Make Your Book More Available. This comes from the Authors Alliance. If you go to the Authors Alliance website, you can find this resource available and you can download it and read it. And Janie, for your question, I would take a look at that book and see what they say about this sort of situation, which I know is common, where you've got these old contracts that have vague language surrounding reversion. The old language basically says, as long as the book is in print, we can continue to publish it. Well, you know how easy it is to keep a book in print now. I mean, it's as easy as keeping a print-on-demand edition available or making the ebook available. So that's why it's necessary to have more specifics today in the reversion clause. Fortunately, there is a little known facet of the law that says if you signed a contract I think it's 25 years. If you signed it 25 years ago and you haven't been able to get your rights back, there is like a window of time where you can get it back under the law. I apologize that I don't have any more specifics than that, but there is an escape hatch, at least in the United States. I can't say if that applies in the UK or not. So if you've been stuck in this terrible contract for 25 years with a terrible reversion clause, you can claw the book back. I would also say that if you're having trouble, please join the Authors Guild, at least for those of you in the US. In the UK, I think it's the Society of Authors. I have to assume that they have some similar assistance where they can help give you some advice or let you know what might be possible to get that reversion. So going back here through the questions, catching up a little bit, Lisa asked if I could explain again what I've said about copyright. She says, from what I've seen, many books are published with the copyright owned by the publisher. And I assume this means that the author agreed to transfer the copyright to the publisher as part of the contract. If it actually says copyright 2020 and then lists the publisher name, then yes, that the copyright's in the name of the publisher and not in the name of the author. But usually, at least for most books published in the United States, it says copyright and then it has the name of the author. Just because the publisher's name and information is in the book doesn't mean that they own the copyright. So you have to look at what's sitting there right next to the copyright symbol. And it is typically on the left-hand side. When you open the book, it's on the left-hand side of the page, opposite the title page very often. So if the author's name isn't there, then they must have signed a contract that said, this is a work for hire. But I don't think that in traditional publishing that I'm talking about, this is not that common. Jenna asks about the royalty escalators and whether they vary for print, ebook, and audio. Thank you for asking, because the escalators that I showed earlier, just to go back for a second to make sure we're all clear about what we're talking about. Oops, wrong direction. This is most prevalent with print. So today, almost all book publishing contracts for ebook sales will pay you 25% net, and there aren't any escalators usually. I mean, I don't know. I can't look at every contract ever offered, but generally speaking, the escalators are most common with print sales. And I haven't seen escalators with audio myself, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Okay. Karen asks, is there an opportunity to regain my rights after so many months of the on sale date, like after 18 months or after 2 years, given that publishers typically stop marketing so quickly after the book is published? This would really only be possible if you signed a fixed term contract. So a fixed term would say this contract expires or can be renewed in 2 years, 4 years, and that's a very specific term that's laid out. It's pretty rare for a big publisher contract to offer that sort of fixed time length. It's almost always what we call life of copyright. So life of copyright means that the rights will not revert to you unless something in the reversion clause triggers that. And it has to be based on a sales, usually on a sales basis or a payment basis. So if the publisher really has stopped doing anything and sales drop to that really low level, then you can ask for the rights back. Cornelia says, I've avoided finding an agent because she's looking for a contract that has no advance, and which, yes, that would absolutely deter an agent. They make their money off of the advances. She says, I'm seeking a publisher because I need to write the book, and typography is the most important element. So where do I go from here? I mean, it's publishers that don't offer an advance. I mean, they're out there, but I don't think you're going to find a list that just says these are the no advance publishers. But there is a good list I often reference on medium.com. It's called the big list of independent publishers. If someone is familiar with the post that I'm talking about, maybe you can put a link into the chat. But if you Google the big list of indie publishers, that might be a place to start looking for someone. But whether they're going to prioritize typography, I have no idea. You'll have to make sure that that priority for you is made clear to the publisher before you sign the agreement. Tom asks if the lit agent also gets commission on the sales in addition to the advance. Yes, so the agent makes 15% of everything you make. So they get 15% of the advance, they get 15% of the royalties, assuming you collect royalties, they get 15% of the subright sales, although sometimes their percentage jumps to 20 if they're working with a co-agent to sell foreign rights or translation rights or movie rights. So yes, they're going to get paid every time you get paid. Okay. Now I've almost exclusively been talking about magazine contracts and I'm sorry, book contracts. I have not touched on magazine contracts for the most part, although a lot of the same principles apply. It's just a little different. If you're looking at a magazine contract, and by magazine, let me say this would include online magazines, websites, online publications of all kinds, literary journals, anthologies, essay collections, newspapers. Let's call them article contracts, where you're granting rights for a fairly small piece of writing, something that's an article, a feature, a column, an essay. So these types of contracts in the olden days often talked about, and still do to some extent, what we call first North American serial rights. And it basically means that publisher is going to be the first to publish this new unpublished work. They're going to be the first. And the contract answers a lot of questions related to how long they get to be the first and only publisher of that material. So you quickly get into issues of exclusivity. So how long are they the exclusive publisher of this article? Is it 1 month? Is it 1 year? Is it 10 years? I mean, usually with magazines, it's based on their frequency. So if you publish an article at a site or a magazine and they come out with new material every week or every month, usually the exclusivity they want doesn't last that long, maybe a few months at most, maybe 6 months. And then at a certain point, the material becomes non-exclusive and you both have the ability to use it or to have it available or to publish it. With the online world, this has made some of these contracts a little tricky because, if a magazine puts your article up online as part of its issue, or if it's in a digital issue that's available to subscribers, they need the right to make that available as part of the issue or as part of the site, usually indefinitely. And so that's when the contract moves from exclusive arrangements to non-exclusive, where you still retain rights to the material, but they also have the right to keep it as part of their digital issue or their site or whatever it happens to be. So the key questions here are, how long do they have that exclusive control over the content? When does it move to non-exclusive? Do they ever lose the rights to that material? Do they have free reign to repurpose it, reprint it, sell these sub-rights like film and TV rights, turn it into audio editions? So there are lots of different ways that especially online publications can use your material. And so the contract should address those other types of sub-rights or mediums that they may decide to distribute the content in. And what's normal is there is no normal, because every magazine or online publication is different in terms of what they do. There has been a move in the last few years for really big publications like the New Yorker or the New York Times, other really big shot publications, to retain TV and film rights to the work, which didn't used to be done, but that's turned into some really significant money because of the streaming world that we live in, the world of Netflix. So sometimes there's some really significant rights that can be sold, or there's option money that can be had. And I know that journalists and writers are struggling with how to retain those rights or how to be compensated fairly when the magazine wants to retain that. So this is one area where agents, unless you already have an agent for your book, agents, you can't get one just to negotiate your magazine contract. So a lot of the burden falls on you as the writer to be able to sort through the particulars and to know where this publication is flexible. Again, I want to emphasize that contracts are a negotiation. I would never accept the first contract I was offered. I would try and push in every place that it looks like I could push, and that includes the payment. So this is where experience really benefits you, because knowing the finer points of how the publication works, what other writers have experienced too, will help you know what to ask for. So there are two resources I want to point you to in the chat. I have put a link to my Contracts 101 piece that really, it's like a 35-page document that goes into the particulars of contract negotiation. And I think for those of you looking at article and essay contracts like this could be very useful for you. There's also a resource called Study Hall. It's at studyhall.xyz, and it's a community of freelancers and journalists where they talk about what's normal or standard in the contracts that they're receiving from publishers. So, you can run some searches in their discussion groups, or you can just pose the question to find out where you should be pushing or negotiating for a better deal. I'll end on, at least for my formal comments, I'll end on God is love, but get it in writing. A contract, as I said, is not for the good times, it's for the bad times. And if there is something that's really important to you about an agreement you're entering into with the publisher, you need to make sure it's addressed in the contract. Cornelia asked about a book publication where the typography is really important to her. I mean, it's pretty rare for publishers to put something in the contract that deals with the particulars of design. But if there's something that's not negotiable for you, then see if you can get it in the contract. Get it in writing, because if your editor leaves or if the publisher's leadership changes, who knows, things happen. You've still got it in writing there in the contract to protect you no matter what happens. Okay, I'm going to take a look at the questions. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, I'm only looking at the questions here in the Zoom webinar. I will take a look later on at the Facebook thread if there are questions there. Diana asks if it's better to work with an agent who has a legal background. Not necessarily. I mean, there are some agents who also have been lawyers or they have law degrees, but I don't think that necessarily makes them better agents. They just have to know publishing contracts, and the good ones do. Like, I think the importance of their experience is in knowing what these contracts look like generally, and what these contracts look like specifically from certain imprints or from certain houses. And they know how to push, they know what's not standard, and that's where you really benefit from their expertise. It's not necessarily the legal stuff, it's just knowing the norms of book publishing. Miffy asks, is the 15% for agents for all payments to the author a standard in the industry or just an example? That's pretty much the standard. You might find agents operating outside of that 15%, but I haven't seen one. So I would say if they're going higher, that would give me serious pause. I don't know why they would go lower, but it's possible they might go down to 10%, but I haven't seen that. Denise says, would you give the name of the book or author you mentioned regarding reversion clauses? Yes, let me go back to that slide. The book I mentioned is Understanding Rights Reversion: When, Why, and How to Regain Copyright and Make Your Book More Available. So this guide is from the Authors Alliance. It has several different authors associated with it. So go to the Authors Alliance website and you'll find this guide freely available on their site for download. And they also have a lot of other good resources. Karen asks if I would go back and talk about payment options for book contracts. Yes, I'd be happy to. So let's go back to the payment slide here. Yes, so it used to be, Karen says, there were 3 or 4 payments, and I understand they're stretching those out sometimes all the way to publication. That's true. So again, in the old days, I mean, the old days weren't that long ago. Let's say the 1990s were the old days. You would typically have 3 payments for the advance, or maybe just 2. So there would be the payment on signing of the contract. There would be payment on delivery, or payment on some milestone, like maybe delivery of half the manuscript, or delivery of an outline, or like just some middle stage. And then there might be payment on acceptance of the manuscript. So that you could also break that down into 2 payments if the publisher's super author friendly. So that would be payment on signing, half up front, and then the other half upon acceptance of the manuscript. So you get the 3rd payment when there's maybe, like I said, some sort of milestone in between those 2 points. Some publishers have started having 3 payments where it's a 1/3 on signing, a 1/3 on acceptance, and a 1/3 upon publication of the book. Even worse, some are stretching it out to after publication, which it's not in advance when they're paying you after the book is published, but it might be 4 payments. So you get 25% on signing, 25% on manuscript acceptance, 25% on publication, and 25% 6 months after the book comes out. I think that's insane. But I know that it happens. Agents will fight that tooth and nail if you have one. So I think, the best of all worlds would, the best situation is the 2 payments, half up front, half on acceptance. What you'll probably have to accept, 3 payments. And I hope you don't get into 4 payments. That would be bad. All right. I've got a question about how do you keep intellectual property rights with a character, idea, etc. You can't protect an idea. Bottom line, you just can't. But if you are, I'll use Harry Potter as an example because it's an example that everyone knows. If you start writing in the Harry Potter universe and publishing your books, you can't do it because you are clearly infringing on the author's intellectual property rights by doing that. The same is true for any sort of established character, series, world, universe. It's true of Star Wars and Star Trek and all of the franchises and things that that are established and probably have registered trademarks. So if you have a series, you could look at registering the trademark. But aside from copyrighting the work with the Copyright Office, there's really nothing further for you to do to protect your rights. And I want to add here that for those who are really scared, frightened, fearful of this issue, like of their rights being stolen, litigating these cases is not easy. It's very expensive. And usually one simple cease and desist for the receiving party is enough to make them stop. And if it's not, God help you, hopefully you wouldn't have to go into court. But it's a federal court issue. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but it's not something like you can go into small claims court and sort out. It's like a federal court issue. Authors Guild is trying to change that to make it easier to litigate copyright cases, but we're not there yet. So in any event, all that to say, don't worry about it. Like in most cases, others aren't. I mean, you should be more worried about probably piracy rather than someone running away with your characters or ideas. Maddie asks if contracts with traditional publishers generally include a clause that prevents the author from sharing the details of the contract. Not usually. There's not usually that sort of, you may not talk about this sort of clause, but there is a taboo in publishing against discussing the terms of your contract, and your agent will tell you not to. However, as anyone could tell, during the Publishing Paid Me, what phenomenon, I guess you might call it, hashtag Publishing Paid Me, this happened in June. Everyone took to Twitter and talked about the advances they received. I think that is actually quite helpful. It's helpful for everyone. The transparency is incredible. It just helps us understand so much better our position, what others are getting. It helps us ask for what we're worth. So I hope that more people are, that we break out of this taboo of not talking about what the terms are, what advances look like, what royalties look like. And maybe Publishing Paid Me will inspire more of that transparency and sharing. Sayward says she was published in an online magazine in 2018, but there wasn't a contract. So is this agreement something that may be stated on their website, and by allowing them to publish your piece, it's considered you signing this contract? I'm so glad you brought this up, because I know a lot of people are in this situation where you've published some piece, there was never a formal agreement, and now what? Like what? Who holds the rights? When do they revert, etc. The first thing I would look at is there any sort of email correspondence, communication that would serve as an agreement? Because that does actually hold up in a court in many cases, that you had this agreement via email. So you could look to that, but it's probably not too specific about rights. And usually the assumption is that if you signed, or not if you signed, if you agreed to have this thing published, you remain the copyright holder unless you signed something that said it was a work for hire, but you didn't. And usually, you should feel free to republish or reuse that content however you wish, since there was no agreement stating that they were holding rights indefinitely or exclusively. It wouldn't hurt if you're able to get in touch with them, like if this online magazine still exists, if you have a contact, it wouldn't hurt to touch base, see what their assumptions or expectations are. But if I were you, I would feel free to do what I wanted with the material in the absence of any agreement. Larry asks if an author can negotiate contract terms that bind the publisher to a specific performance on marketing efforts. Not unless you're a huge name. You can't really do that. Most publishing contracts don't include a marketing section. So unless you're someone like Stephen King, it's really hard to force the publisher's hand. They want to keep things pretty loose. They don't want to commit to something that doesn't make sense in another year or 2 years' time. Like imagine if the publisher was contractually obligated to do something with a tour during the pandemic, and then they couldn't live up to that. I'm sure there would be an out in the contract, I would hope, if they weren't able to live up to their end of the agreement. But in any event, no, it's very unlikely you'll be able to negotiate that. Tom asks if there's anything that comes to mind that I'd warn people against to not be taken advantage of as far as certain royalty percentages, certain rights. I mean, I think I laid out most of what you would need to know from a royalties perspective, like what's common. I think it's sad when people agree to a royalty percentage that never changes, no matter how successful the book is. I think that's by far the biggest way you can get taken advantage of, is to keep earning that low royalty when your book becomes a bestseller. So that's the big one. And the other thing with the advance I mentioned, where you're under some sort of duress or there's some high risk of you paying that advance back because the publisher just randomly decided they didn't want to publish the book, which is not your fault. So those are the two biggest issues that often come into play. One other issue, it's rare that this happens, like rare. But there are instances of bad publishers behaving badly where they will charge the author for fixing the manuscript if the author refuses to do so. So in other words, maybe you disagreed with revisions they wanted you to make, and now the contract gives them the right to take your manuscript, send it to someone else, have them fix it, and then charge you for that. That's pretty bad, right? But there's contract language out there that allows for it. So just read the fine print really closely to make sure that they can't do that. That shouldn't be standard, but it does still creep in to some contracts. All right. Larry asks, what sort of turnaround time does the Authors Guild offer for the contract review? And I honestly don't know. I imagine it's subject to change, but let me say that I haven't heard complaints that they're slow. So I would definitely consider using them. Another person to consider, which I mentioned earlier, is Peter Beren, B-E-R-E-N. He's a really great resource for people who need the expertise of an agent on just a limited basis for, just to look at a contract. Diana asks, when do I recommend copywriting the work? Should you wait and let the publisher do this? Yes, I suggest waiting. If you're signing a traditional publishing contract, let the publisher file. They're going to file really close to the publication date because they want to submit the most representative work. I mean, if the work gets revised too much, then it might not be covered by that copyright filing. So you want to be submitting the thing that's as close to the publication date as possible. All right. So I'm going to stop there since we're at the top of the hour. I have another sermon coming up in 2 weeks on July 26th. I saw a question that someone said this sermon isn't yet reflected on the site, but I think it might be a caching issue. So if you refresh your browser or force refresh your browser and go to the Sunday Business Sermons page, you can register for that. If not, I will fix it within the next hour and make sure that it's up. But so for the July 26th sermon, I'm going to talk about how I offer online courses through my courses website, which has been quite a journey over the last 5 years. It's for those of you who are really interested in the intricacies of WordPress and plugins. I'm going to be talking about development work and coding. So for the more geeky of my audience, I think you'll really appreciate it, especially if you run a WordPress site. If you don't use WordPress, I don't know that you should sign up for it unless you're just super curious about the back end of my website. And then I have many online courses being offered this summer and through the fall. You can find those at my site under the online classes tab. So thank you all so much for coming and joining me on this Sunday. I hope this was useful, and I just want to reiterate for those of you joining the Zoom webinar, if you scroll up to the chat, to the very beginning of the chat, you will find a link to the Contracts 101 document, which is like this 35-page detailed breakdown of what you will find in most publishing contracts, both book and magazine. And then for those of you watching on Facebook, I'm going to drop this link into the comments so that you have it. So good luck, everyone, with your contract negotiation, and have a wonderful Sunday. Bye-bye.